The wind howled through the plains, whispering secrets through the tall grass, carrying the scent of autumn decay and wood smoke as Elias pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The night was cold, but not as cold as the world that had turned against him from the moment he had been born into it. A world that had taken his mother's language, forced his father into a white man's clothes, and left his people with nothing but shrinking land and broken promises. He had learned early that survival was not just in the body but in silence, in knowing when to lower his eyes, when to nod, when to speak the English words that they wanted to hear and swallow the ones that lived in his heart. But none of that had mattered the night he met her. The train station had been crowded, filled with the scent of wet wool and the distant sound of horses' hooves on muddy streets, but nothing had been as sharp or as unexpected as the sight of her, Margaret Winthrop, daughter of one of the most powerful men in the territory, stepping onto the platform with a quiet grace that made the world around her seem dull. She wasn't supposed to look at him. He wasn't supposed to look at her. But she had turned her head, her eyes locking onto his with a kind of searching curiosity that he knew could only lead to trouble. And trouble had followed them ever since. Their first words had been stolen moments, whispered at the edges of town, behind the mercantile where no one would see, beneath the willow tree where the river ran slower, thick with summer heat. She had spoken of books and music and the life her father had planned for her, a marriage to a banker's son, a future built on expectations she had no say in. He had spoken of the land, of the stories his grandfather used to tell before the government men came with papers and maps, of the things he had lost and the things he refused to forget. They had met in defiance of everything, knowing that each touch, each glance, each stolen hour brought them closer to a reckoning neither of them was ready to face. The first time she kissed him, it had been in the shadow of an old oak tree, the night alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant laughter from a town dance she had abandoned just to be with him. Her hands had been warm against his jaw, hesitant but determined, and for a moment he let himself believe that there was a world where they could exist beyond fear. But that world was not this one. The rumors started before they could stop them, whispered in church pews and across bar counters, muttered by old women who watched too closely from their porches. He could feel the shift in the way people looked at him, the way shopkeepers hesitated before handing him change, the way white men on horseback rode just a little too close when he walked the dirt roads home. Margaret's father found out first. He had dragged her home, locked her away behind lace curtains and heavy doors, but she found a way back to Elias, slipping notes into the hands of children, leaving them beneath loose bricks near the schoolhouse. He had known then that they were running out of time. The night they planned to leave, the sky was dark with the promise of rain, the wind restless as if the earth itself was warning them. He had waited by the river, his heart a steady drumbeat against his ribs, his hands trembling with the weight of what they were about to do. But Margaret never came. Instead, there were voices, heavy boots against wet ground, the gleam of lanterns swinging through the trees. They had found her first. The sheriff had been a friend of her father's, a man who believed that certain lines were never meant to be crossed. They had dragged Elias from the riverbank, his protests swallowed by the roar of the storm, their fists answering every word he tried to speak. When he woke, the sky was pale with dawn, and Margaret was gone. He searched for her, for days, for weeks, but the house where she had lived was suddenly empty, the windows shuttered, the garden overgrown as if she had never been there at all. They said she had been sent east, to a finishing school, to a place where she would forget the foolish things of her youth. They said she had married, that she had learned her lesson. They said many things, but Elias knew the truth. He saw it in the way her father refused to meet his eyes in town, in the way the sheriff tightened his grip on his rifle when Elias walked by. He had lost her, not to time or distance, but to the world that had never wanted them to exist at all. Years passed, the town grew, the old oak tree fell in a summer storm, and the river changed course, erasing the place where they had once dreamed of something more. But some ghosts do not rest. It was nearly 20 years later when he saw her again, in a city far from home, her hair streaked with silver, her hands clutching the arm of a husband who did not know the way she once whispered Elias's name. Their eyes met across the street, a lifetime contained in a single glance, and in that moment he saw everything, the love, the loss, the regret, the unbearable weight of what could have been. She did not speak. Neither did he. But as she turned away, disappearing into the crowd, he knew that some stories do not end, they only echo through time, waiting to be remembered. Elias stood frozen in place long after Margaret had disappeared into the faceless sea of people, his breath shallow, his pulse thrumming in his ears like a war drum. He had imagined this moment countless times, replaying the memories of her touch, the way her voice used to wrap around his name like a prayer, the stolen hours beneath the stars when the world outside had no power to harm them. But in all those visions, he had never imagined the way she would turn away, the way her hands would clutch at the fabric of another man's coat as if she were holding herself together. He had known she was gone, known she had been sent away, but a part of him had always believed, hoped, that she had fought, that she had resisted the fate they had forced upon her. Now he saw the truth. The years had caged her, shaped her into something unrecognizable, but the eyes were the same, and the sorrow in them cut through him deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. The city around him moved on, indifferent to his grief, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and factory whistles blending into a discordant symphony that made him feel small, invisible, as if the love they had shared had never existed at all. But it had existed. He had bled for it. He had nearly died for it. And now, standing on a street that did not belong to him, in a world that had no place for men like him to grieve, he knew he could not let it end here. He moved, pushing through the crowded street, his boots heavy against the damp pavement, his hands trembling at his sides. She was ahead, her figure a ghost weaving through the masses, her husband a shadow at her side. Elias followed, not knowing what he would say, not knowing if he would say anything at all, only knowing that he could not let her vanish again without trying to reclaim even a fragment of what had been stolen from them. The rain started as a whisper against his skin, soft and hesitant, but the sky carried the weight of an impending storm. He had always hated the rain. It reminded him of that night by the river, the night she had never come, the night he had been dragged through the mud like an animal, the night they had beaten him until he could no longer stand, until the world had become nothing but pain and darkness. He had woken to find his body broken, his heart hollow, his world forever changed. And now, decades later, the rain fell again, as if the universe itself was demanding that he remember, that he relive every moment of agony before he faced her once more. Margaret reached the steps of a grand building, the kind of place where men in press suits and women in silk dresses gathered to discuss things that would never touch the lives of men like Elias. Her husband spoke to someone at the door, laughter rolling off his tongue with the ease of a man who had never known suffering, never known what it was to love someone the world had forbidden him to love. Elias clenched his fists, every muscle in his body tense, his mind screaming at him to turn away, to let her go, to leave her to the life she had chosen, or the life that had been chosen for her. But then, as if she had felt him there, Margaret turned. Their eyes met, and this time she did not look away. For a heartbeat, there was nothing between them but silence, a silence that carried the weight of 20 years of unsaid words, of nights spent wondering what could have been. And then she moved. Her husband was still speaking, unaware, but Margaret's hand fell from his arm, her step small, hesitant, but deliberate as she descended the stairs, each one bringing her closer to the past she had buried. Elias did not breathe. She stopped just inches from him, the rain darkening her hair, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but could not find the words. And he saw it then, the war raging inside her, the battle between duty and desire, between the life she had lived and the one she had lost. He opened his mouth, his voice raw, desperate. "Margaret!" But before he could finish, before he could ask the question that had burned inside him for 2 decades, a voice shattered the fragile moment. "Margaret?" Her husband had noticed. His voice was sharp, threaded with confusion and something else, something dangerously close to suspicion. Margaret flinched, and in that instant, Elias saw it all slip away. She turned to her husband, her hand lifting to smooth the front of her dress, her mask slipping back into place with the ease of a woman who had been pretending for far too long. "It's nothing," she said, the words a dagger in Elias's chest. "Just an old acquaintance." And then, just like that, she was gone again, walking back into the world that had stolen her from him, leaving him standing in the rain, watching as the past closed its doors once more. He did not move. He did not call after her. He had fought fate once and lost. To do it again would only end the same way. But as she disappeared into the warm glow of the building, into a life where he would never belong, Elias made himself one final promise. She might have forgotten. The world might have erased them. But he would remember. And some ghosts do not rest. Elias stood there long after the door shut behind her, after the last echo of her footsteps faded into the marble halls of a world he could never enter, the rain soaking through his clothes, dripping from his lashes, mixing with the salt of his own regret. His fingers twitched at his sides, aching to reach for her, to grab hold of time and drag it backward to a moment when they had been free, or at least, as free as love had ever allowed them to be. But the past was an unforgiving thing, a heavy weight on his chest that he had carried for 20 years, and now, as he watched the night swallow her whole, he felt the crushing realization that there were no second chances, no miracles for men like him, only the cold certainty of history repeating itself, again and again, until the last breath left his body. He forced himself to turn away, to put one foot in front of the other, to disappear into the dark streets where no one would care who he was, or why his soul felt like it was breaking apart. He walked without direction, without thought, the sounds of the city merging into a dull hum around him, the glow of street lamps flickering through the rain like distant stars, unreachable, indifferent. His mind drifted back to the first time he had seen her, the way the late summer sun had caught in her hair as she laughed, the sound like river water slipping over smooth stones. She had been a vision then, a dream wrapped in a body too fragile for the world they lived in, and yet she had loved him. Despite the warnings, despite the whispers, despite the knowledge that every moment they stole was another step toward destruction. He had been a fool to believe they could outrun it. The memory of that last night together clawed its way to the surface, unbidden, unwanted, but relentless in its cruelty. The way she had pressed her hand to his chest, her voice trembling as she told him she would meet him by the river, that they would leave before the dawn, before anyone could stop them. He had waited. Hours, then longer, his heart pounding against his ribs, like a caged thing desperate for release, and when she never came, he had known. They had found her. They had taken her away. And then they had come for him. He shook the memory off like a dog shaking free of water, but it clung to him, seeped into his skin like the rain, a poison he had never been able to purge. He had never stopped wondering what they had told her, what lies they had spun to turn her against him, to make her believe a life without him was better than the fire they would have burned her in for loving him. And now, all these years later, she had stood before him, close enough to touch, to save, and yet she had chosen to walk away. Again. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, forcing himself to keep walking, because if he stopped, if he let the grief take him now, he might never rise from it. But then he heard it, a voice, soft, hesitant, barely cutting through the sound of rain against the cobblestones. His name. He turned so fast he nearly lost his footing, his heart a wild, thrashing thing inside his chest, and there she was. Margaret. Alone. Standing at the end of the street, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders, her breath coming fast as if she had run, as if she had fought something, someone, to be here. His feet moved before he could think, before he could question if this was real or if his mind, desperate and broken, had conjured her from the depths of his longing. But then she was in front of him, her hands reaching, trembling, and before he could stop himself, before he could consider what it meant, he caught them in his own, pressing her fingers against the warmth of his skin, grounding himself in the reality of her presence. "I couldn't," she started, her voice breaking, her lips trembling like she was on the verge of crumbling. "I couldn't let it end like that." He exhaled, a shuddering thing, a sound of relief, of grief, of something too deep to name. "Margaret," he whispered, and she closed her eyes, as if hearing her name from his lips was both a comfort and a curse. "They told me you left," she said, and when she opened her eyes, he saw the years of pain, of confusion, of betrayal buried within them. "They told me you ran." He felt his stomach drop, the full weight of their stolen years settling like lead in his bones. "I never ran," he said, his voice rough with the truth he had never been able to speak aloud. "They came for me. They dragged me through the dirt and left me for dead. And when I woke up, you were gone." A sharp inhale, her fingers tightening around his, her body swaying as if the truth had physically struck her. "They told me you didn't want me anymore," she whispered, and the sheer cruelty of it made his blood run cold. "That you realized what we were doing was wrong, that you had found someone else, that you left so I could have a better life." He felt rage burn in his throat, not at her, never at her, but at the world, at the people who had stolen not just their love, but the very foundation of their truth. "They lied," he said, every syllable an oath. "They lied to keep us apart." A tear slipped down her cheek, and he reached up without thinking, brushing it away with the same tenderness he had once been allowed to show her. She leaned into the touch, a single, broken movement that told him everything she could not put into words. "It's too late," she breathed, but there was no conviction in it, only sorrow, only longing. He shook his head, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones, memorizing her all over again. "No," he said, his voice steady, strong. "It's not." The rain fell harder, washing the city in silver, drowning out the rest of the world until it was just them, just this moment, just the promise of what could still be if they were brave enough to take it. And then, for the first time in 20 years, Margaret made a choice. She stepped forward, closing the last of the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his, a kiss filled with every lost year, every unspoken word, every stolen dream. And Elias knew, no matter what came next, no matter what the world did to them this time, they would not be torn apart again. Elias barely had time to breathe before Margaret pulled away, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize every inch of him before the world had a chance to rip them apart again, and he felt it, the weight of the years between them, the ghosts of what had been stolen, the pain that had shaped them both into people neither of them had ever wanted to become, but here they were, standing in the rain, clinging to something that had never been given a chance to survive, and he wasn't sure if it was madness or hope that made him believe it still could, still might, if only they were willing to fight for it this time. But before he could speak, before he could ask her what came next, she was already pulling him forward, her fingers tied around his wrist, dragging him through the rain-soaked streets with a determination that made his heart slam against his ribs, because Margaret had always been like this, reckless and full of fire, willing to burn down everything for the sake of love. But as much as he wanted to believe they were safe in this moment, he knew better, knew that the world did not forgive, did not forget, knew that the ghosts of their past were waiting just beyond the next corner, ready to remind them that love had never been enough to save anyone. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because for the first time in 20 years, she had chosen him, had run to him instead of away. And even if this was only a borrowed moment, a stolen dream, he would not waste it. So he let her lead him, let the streets blur around them, let the rain soak into his skin until he felt like he was dissolving into the night itself, until they reached the small, dimly lit alley behind the boarding house where she had been staying, and she turned to face him, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her fingers still wrapped tightly around his, as if she was afraid that if she let go, even for a second, he would disappear like he had before, and the thought of that, of losing her again, made something inside him crack open, something raw and vulnerable and unguarded, and he pulled her against him, holding her so tightly he thought they might fuse together, become something unbreakable, something the world could not tear apart, But then she was speaking, her voice barely above a whisper, telling him that they had to leave, that she couldn't go back to that house, that they would come for her when they realized she was gone, that she had already given up too much for a life she never wanted. And Elias knew she was right, knew that staying meant death, meant losing her all over again, meant standing at another grave wondering why the world never let them be. So he nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead before taking her hand and leading her toward the only place he knew they could go, the train station on the edge of town, where no one asked questions and the darkness was thick enough to hide in. And as they walked, he tried not to think about the last time he had fled through these streets, bruised and bleeding, the taste of betrayal thick on his tongue, the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears as he realized he would never see her again. But now she was beside him. Now they were running together. And even though the fear still clawed at his throat, he let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time the world would look away. Maybe this time they would make it to the other side of the darkness. But then the sound of boots on cobblestone shattered that fragile hope, and he felt Margaret stiffen beside him, her grip tightening around his fingers as they both turned toward the noise, toward the approaching figures, toward the past coming back to claim them. And he knew, without a doubt, that the world had found them once again. Elias didn't have time to think, only react, pulling Margaret against him as his eyes darted to the narrowest path between the looming brick buildings, a shadowed alleyway slick with rain and mud, and he yanked her toward it just as the boots behind them picked up speed, voices sharp and cutting through the night like the crack of a rifle, demanding them to stop. But stopping meant death, meant the noose, meant another nameless body buried beneath the weight of history and silence. So they ran, feet slipping on the wet stones, breath ragged and desperate, hearts pounding like war drums. And Margaret wasn't used to running like this, wasn't used to the constant fear, wasn't used to the way the world hunted him like an animal while letting her slip through its fingers untouched. But now she was just as much a fugitive as he was, and she didn't falter, didn't hesitate, only clung to him like she had made her choice long ago and would never look back. And he loved her for it, loved her in a way that ached, in a way that felt like drowning and breathing all at once. But love wouldn't save them, not now, not with the past closing in around them like a fist. And he could hear the shouts getting closer, could feel the weight of the city pressing down on them, and he knew they had to disappear, had to vanish into the night like ghosts, or else they would never make it out alive. So he took the next turn blindly, pulling her down a side street so narrow they had to squeeze between the buildings, bricks scraping against their clothes, hands slipping on rain-soaked wood as they clambered over a crumbling fence, landing in the overgrown backyard of a house that hadn't seen life in years. And for a moment, just a moment, there was silence, only the sound of their gasping breaths and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the sky. But then Margaret's fingers dug into his arm, her eyes wide and full of something he couldn't name, and he turned just in time to see the figures stepping into the alley behind them, lantern swinging, faces hard with purpose. And he knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they would not stop hunting them, not tonight, not ever, because men like him weren't meant to run, weren't meant to take what the world had denied them, weren't meant to love women like her. And the sight of them together was enough to make men kill, enough to turn justice into vengeance, enough to burn everything to the ground. So he grabbed her hand again, whispered run, and they did, slipping through the tangled weeds, past broken windows and rotting wood, climbing another fence just as the shouts erupted behind them, and they were in the streets again, legs burning, lungs on fire, the city stretching out before them like a maze designed to keep them trapped. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the train station, the last hope, the only way out, and he didn't think, only ran faster, pulling Margaret with him as they weaved through the late-night stragglers, past carriages and lamplight, and the thick scent of smoke curling in the air. And he could hear them still, behind him, relentless, merciless. But the train was there, steam rising in heavy clouds, doors still open, and it was now or never. So he didn't slow, didn't hesitate, only grabbed her waist and lifted her onto the step as the whistle blew, as the wheels groaned against the tracks. And then, he was pulling himself up just as hands reached for him, just as voices cursed his name, just as Margaret screamed his name, and then the train lurched forward, and the world blurred, and he collapsed into the narrow corridor beside her, heart hammering, hands shaking, breath coming in ragged bursts, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he had won or simply delayed the inevitable, but then she was there, pressing her hands to his face, whispering his name like a prayer. And for just a moment, just one stolen second, he let himself believe that they had made it, that love had outrun death, that maybe, just maybe, the world had finally let them go. The train rattled beneath them, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails the only sound filling the space between their gasping breaths, Margaret's hands still cupping his face, her eyes searching his as if making sure he was real, that they were real, that they had somehow escaped the iron grip of fate that had been closing around them since the moment their hands first touched. Since the moment their eyes met across the invisible wall that the world had built between them, and Elias let himself close his eyes for just a moment, let himself lean into her touch, let himself believe that they had done the impossible, but the reality settled in his bones like a cold weight, because escape was never that simple, not for him, not for them, and as the train pushed forward into the night, leaving behind the city that had tried to consume them, he knew it was only a matter of time before the past caught up, because men like him didn't just disappear, not when there were those who saw his love for Margaret as a crime that demanded punishment, not when there were laws and hatred and the long, unrelenting arm of vengeance reaching for them from the dark. And so he pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers, breathing in the scent of rain and smoke and the lingering trace of her perfume, whispering her name like a promise, and she didn't flinch, didn't look away, only held onto him as tightly as he held onto her, their bodies swaying with the motion of the train, their future uncertain but, for now, still theirs to claim. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but edged with steel, asking where they would go, what they would do, how they would stay ahead of the forces determined to tear them apart, and Elias exhaled slowly, letting the question settle between them, because he had no answers, only instincts, only the unshakable knowledge that he could never stop running, never stop fighting, never stop holding on to her with everything he had, because if he let go, if he faltered for even a second, the world would rip her from his arms and erase every trace of the love they had dared to claim. And so he told her they would head west, to the territories where names changed and pasts could be buried, where they could find a patch of land and build something no one could take from them. And Margaret nodded, determination hardening in her eyes, because she wasn't just running for love, wasn't just risking everything for the way he made her feel, but because she had seen the truth now, had tasted the lies of the world she had been raised in, had felt the sting of its hypocrisy, and she could never go back, never unsee the ugliness beneath the civility, never return to a life where she turned a blind eye to suffering just because it didn't belong to her. And Elias loved her for that, for the fire beneath the softness, for the way she had chosen him not just in secret, not just in stolen whispers, but in the open defiance of everything she had ever known. And he kissed her then, kissed her like the world wasn't chasing them, like the future wasn't a storm waiting on the horizon, like they were already free, and for a moment, for just a heartbeat, they were, but the world never let go that easily. And as the train slowed at a small town station, as the doors groaned open and the scent of damp earth filled the carriage, Elias stiffened, his body tensing with the old, familiar warning of danger, because stepping onto the platform, scanning the passengers with sharp, hungry eyes, were two men dressed in the stiff uniforms of lawmen, their expressions hard, their hands resting on the butts of their holstered pistols, and Margaret felt him go still, followed his gaze, her fingers tightening around his wrist, and neither of them breathed as the officers stepped closer, peering into the train, their gazes sweeping over the weary travelers, searching, hunting. And Elias knew they couldn't stay, knew they couldn't wait for the inevitable, so he gripped Margaret's hand, whispered for her to trust him, and the next moment, they were moving, slipping out the opposite door just as the whistle blew again, Just as the train lurched forward, and the officers turned at the movement, their eyes locking onto Elias with the cold, certain recognition of men who knew their quarry, and then there was no more waiting, no more hiding. Only the sharp bark of a command to stop, only the clatter of boots on wood, only the explosion of movement as Elias yanked Margaret into the shadows of the station, into the labyrinth of alleyways beyond, their feet pounding against the dirt, breath ragged, the night swallowing them once more, and the chase began again, because the world would never let them go, not without a fight, not without blood, and Elias knew, as they ran deeper into the darkness, that there would come a time when they would have to stand their ground, when there would be no more running, when love alone wouldn't be enough to save them. But for now, they ran, together, unbroken, unbowed, daring the world to try and take from them what they had already claimed as their own. Elias and Margaret pressed themselves into the dark recesses of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the small town, the sound of pursuit still echoing faintly behind them, as they huddled together in a corner, their breaths coming in rapid, uneven gasps that mixed with the distant rumble of a passing train and the patter of rain against broken glass. And in that cold, cramped space where time seemed to stand still, they clung to each other, as if their very lives depended on the warmth of their intertwined fingers, each heartbeat a reminder of every sacrifice, every tear shed in the shadow of a world determined to keep them apart. And as they listened to the muffled shouts, and the echo of footsteps fading into the night, Elias's mind raced through the memories of a lifetime marked by both pain and defiance, the harsh lessons of a childhood where his identity had been a target, the countless days of quiet endurance in a society that saw him as less than, the stolen moments of forbidden love with Margaret beneath starlit skies where they had dared to dream of a future untainted by prejudice. And now, in the silence of that forgotten warehouse, every unspoken promise surged through him like a tidal wave, urging him to stand up against the relentless tide of hatred, to fight not just for his own survival, but for the right of every soul who had been crushed under the weight of injustice. And Margaret, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears and fierce determination, whispered softly, "We can't keep running forever, Elias. One day we have to show them that love is stronger than their fear." And her words, fragile yet unyielding, stirred something deep within him, a resolve that had been hardened by decades of struggle and sorrow. And even as the sound of approaching footsteps warned them that their sanctuary was compromised, Elias lifted his chin, drawing strength from the legacy of every heart that had beaten in defiance of oppression, and together they emerged from the shadows, stepping into the drizzle of the early morning rain with a boldness that belied the tremor in their limbs, knowing that every step forward was an act of rebellion. Every glance they shared was a silent challenge to a world that had long denied them dignity. And as they ran once more through the empty streets, past shuttered windows and silent alleys, the chase became less about escape and more about reclaiming their stolen identities, about forging a new path in a land that had tried to erase their love. And Elias's thoughts turned to the possibility of a future where their love would no longer be a secret to be hidden under the weight of shame, but a beacon of hope for others who had been silenced, a testament to the unyielding power of the human spirit even in the face of relentless adversity. And every echo of their footsteps on the wet pavement resounded like a drumbeat of revolution, each beat a promise that they would continue to fight until the world learned to see them not as relics of a past marred by prejudice, but as living proof that love, true, defiant, and transcendent, could bridge the darkest divides. And as they reached a crossroads illuminated by the soft glow of a lone street lamp, their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them that this was not the end but merely another chapter in a story that would be written in the blood and tears of those who dared to defy the tyranny of injustice. And with a final, resolute nod, they plunged into the unknown once again, leaving behind the ruins of their past, and stepping toward a horizon where hope, however fragile, shone like the first light of dawn over a land waiting to be reborn. Elias and Margaret didn't stop running until the town was far behind them, until the shouts of angry men had faded into the night, until the only sound left was the labored rhythm of their own breath and the steady pulse of rain against the earth. And even then, they didn't dare to pause for long, knowing that safety was a fragile illusion, a mirage that could disappear the moment they let their guard down, because no matter how far they went, no matter how many miles separated them from the people who had sworn to tear them apart, the world itself was their enemy, a vast and unrelenting force determined to break them, to crush their love beneath the weight of laws and hatred and an unyielding past that refused to let them go. And yet, in the midst of it all, Elias felt Margaret's hand still clasped tightly in his, her fingers laced through his with a grip that refused to surrender, and that, more than anything else, gave him the strength to keep moving, because even if the whole world had turned against them, she was still here, still by his side, still fighting for a love that had been branded as a sin. And for a moment he thought about what it meant to love in a world that told them they were never meant to be together, to want something so badly that it became worth dying for. Because wasn't that what they were doing now? Wasn't that the truth neither of them dared to speak aloud, that no matter how much they ran, no matter how much they fought, their love was a battle against inevitability, a war against a world that had already decided their fate long before they had even met. And yet, in spite of it all, here they were, still alive, still together, still daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for them somewhere beyond the reach of the men who wanted them dead, beyond the whispers, and the glares, and the silent doors slammed in their faces. And so they pressed forward, through the thick, unyielding darkness of the woods, through the tangled web of branches that clawed at their skin and the mud that sucked at their feet, moving with the desperate determination of those who had nothing left to lose, until finally, when the first hints of dawn began to bleed across the sky, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin nestled deep within the trees, its roof sagging from years of neglect, its windows clouded with dust and time. But to Elias, to Margaret, it was salvation, a brief moment of respite in a world that offered them none, and they collapsed inside, breathless, exhausted, their bodies shaking from the cold and the fear and the unspoken truth that neither of them dared to voice, that this was not over, that it would never be over, that no matter how many nights they ran, no matter how many places they hid, the world would always find them. And yet, even knowing that, even with the weight of it pressing down on his chest like an iron chain, Elias still turned to Margaret, still cupped her face in his hands, still pressed his forehead against hers, as if he could somehow will the universe to spare them just this once, just for a little while, and for a moment, just a single moment. It was enough, just to exist here, just to breathe in the scent of her hair and feel the warmth of her skin beneath his fingers, just to know that she was alive, that they were alive, and maybe that was the only victory they would ever be allowed. But if it was, if this was all they would ever have, then he would take it, he would hold on to it with everything he had, because love was never meant to survive in a world like this. And yet somehow, against all odds, theirs had. And as he pulled her close, as he whispered her name like a prayer against the hollow quiet of the cabin, he knew that no matter what came next, no matter how many more nights they spent running, no matter how many more times they were forced to fight for a love that had never been meant to exist, he would never stop, because the moment he did, the moment he let go, the world would win. And that was something he could never allow, not now, not ever. The days stretched on, the tension never easing, always there like a tightening knot in their chests, as Elias and Margaret moved from one place to the next, never staying too long, always keeping to the shadows, avoiding the roads and the towns where prying eyes might catch sight of them, whispering about the couple whose love had become a dangerous thing, an illegal thing, a thing that couldn't be allowed to survive in a world so steeped in fear and hatred. But despite the constant movement, the fear of being caught, they had found a rhythm, a way of existing within this fractured reality, finding fleeting moments of peace in the small spaces they carved out for themselves. In the early mornings, they would wake to the sound of birds and the cool, damp air that clung to the earth. They would find what little food they could, the bare necessities, often scavenging or relying on the kindness of strangers who saw in them something beyond the color of their skin, who saw their humanity. But those moments were rare and fleeting, always shadowed by the knowledge that they couldn't stay for long, that the world was still hunting them, still waiting to tear them apart. And yet, they kept going, kept fighting against the tide of history that had already written their fates. But everything changed the day the weather turned. The first storm came in the middle of the night, sudden and violent, as if the sky itself had decided to unleash its fury upon the earth. They had barely managed to find shelter in a small, dilapidated barn, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls as the rain battered the roof. But even then, as the storm raged around them, they held onto each other, their bodies pressed close for warmth, for comfort, because in a world that had abandoned them, in a world that had never truly seen them, they were all each other had. The storm lasted hours, the night dragging on in an endless blur of wind and rain, until finally, when it seemed like the world would break beneath the weight of the storm, it ended, leaving only a deep, unnatural silence behind. They had barely slept, too afraid to close their eyes for fear of missing something, too afraid to rest for even a moment in case it was their last. But when the storm finally passed, they emerged from the barn, stepping into the aftermath, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and the sharp tang of lightning that had scarred the sky. They were both tired, their faces pale from lack of sleep, their bodies aching from the constant strain, but they pushed forward, forced themselves to keep moving because there was nothing else they could do, nothing but run, nothing but survive. But the world had caught up with them. As they walked along a small, winding road, Elias felt a cold dread crawl up his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, and it wasn't until he saw the shadow of the horses that he knew, without a doubt, that they had been found. He turned to Margaret, his heart hammering in his chest, his throat dry with fear, but she was already looking at him, her eyes wide with the same terror, and for a brief moment, they were silent, just two souls trapped in a world that wouldn't let them be. "We have to run," Elias whispered, his voice hoarse, but Margaret shook her head, grabbing his arm with surprising strength, her grip fierce as she pulled him back. "No, Elias," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't keep running. We can't keep hiding." She looked at him then, and for a moment, her expression softened, the fear melting into something deeper, something more vulnerable. "It's over," she said softly, and the words hit him harder than anything else could, because deep down, he had known it, had felt it in his bones. They couldn't run forever. They couldn't keep hiding in the shadows, pretending that the world didn't know who they were, what they were. He knew it, but he didn't want to accept it. He couldn't accept it. And yet, standing there, in that moment, with the sound of the approaching horses growing louder, he realized that this was the end. This was where their story would break, where the world would tear them apart in the most brutal way possible. And then, just as they were about to make their final escape, just as they were about to disappear into the night for good, they were surrounded. The men who had been hunting them, the men who had been chasing them from town to town, finally caught up with them, their eyes cold and full of hate, their hands gripping the reins of their horses as they dismounted, surrounding Elias and Margaret with an air of finality, as if they had known all along how this would end. There was no escape now, no chance to run, no chance to fight, only the cold reality of what their love had become in the eyes of the world, only the crushing weight of the laws that had kept them apart from the very beginning. And then, in the midst of the tension, in the stillness of the moment before everything collapsed around them, Elias heard Margaret's voice, soft but clear, carrying across the silence between them. "I love you," she said, and the words were both a plea and a defiance, a refusal to let go, a refusal to let the world win. And for a moment, for just one moment, Elias felt the truth of it, the deep, unshakable truth that had carried them through all the fear and the pain, the truth that had kept them fighting even when there seemed to be no hope left. He loved her. He had always loved her. And no matter what happened next, no matter how the world tried to destroy them, no matter how many times they were forced to run, they would always be together, in some way, in some form, because love like theirs couldn't be erased. Not even by the violence of history, not even by the cruelty of the men who stood before them, waiting to tear them apart. But the truth of their love could never save them. And as the men closed in, As they raised their weapons and prepared to do what they had always intended, Margaret and Elias shared one final, desperate look, one last moment of understanding, one last breath, and then they were gone, swallowed by the weight of the world they had never belonged to, leaving behind only the echoes of a love that had never been meant to be. The final moments of their love played out in a blur of motion, sharp, breathless, filled with the pounding rhythm of heartbeats, the cold bite of the night air, and the weight of inevitability. Margaret's hand gripped Elias one last time, a silent promise between them that no matter what the world had done to them, they would always belong to each other. His gaze was intense, unwavering, locking with hers in that instant of pure connection, defying everything that had come before, and everything that would come after. But the world had already decided their fate. The men around them advanced, their faces hard and cold, eyes filled with judgment and hate, as if they had been taught from birth to erase any trace of love that didn't fit within the boundaries of their narrow vision of the world. Elias' heart raced in his chest, his body trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the truth that had burdened him for so long, the truth that love, no matter how pure, would always be crushed beneath the weight of history. With a harsh shout, one of the men lunged forward, the sound of leather against skin sharp in the air. Elias felt the pressure in his chest, his body frozen in place, knowing there was no escape, no miracle to save them now. And then, before he could fully comprehend what was happening, before he could utter another word to Margaret, the crack of gunfire split the night. It echoed through the empty landscape, piercing the quiet, shaking the very earth beneath them. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, her body jerking, and Elias, desperate, reached for her, but his arms failed him, his hands slipping as the world around them blurred. She fell, her body crumpling to the ground in a delicate, fragile heap, like a bird struck from the sky, unable to fly, unable to escape the violence that had been waiting for them all along. Time stretched as if everything had slowed, the air thick and heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The sound of Margaret's name caught in his throat, a final cry of anguish that could not reach her. His world crumbled in that moment, his love, his life, everything that had kept him going, reduced to ash in an instant. Tears stung his eyes, burning with the grief of a loss so profound, so final, that nothing in the world could ever undo it. He sank to his knees beside her, clutching her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin slowly fade, her life-blood slipping through his fingers. He could hear his own voice now, ragged, as he called to her, begged for her to wake, even as he knew deep down that it was too late. The other men stood around them, their eyes cold, as if they had done nothing more than carry out a necessary task, as if they had no idea what they had just destroyed, what they had just stolen from the world. But Elias didn't care anymore. His gaze never left Margaret's still face, her eyes closed, her mouth barely parted as if she was waiting for him to say something, anything that would bring her back. But the words never came. There was nothing left to say. The realization of what had happened, of what they had lost, settled into his bones like ice. And as the minutes ticked by, as the wind continued to howl in the distance, Elias could feel the heaviness of the world bearing down on him. The storm of history that had chased them, the cruelty of the laws that had separated them, all of it came rushing back in a flood, and the weight of it pressed against his chest until he couldn't breathe. He had failed her. He had failed them both. And in that moment, as the darkness crept in and the world around them seemed to fade away, Elias understood, more than ever before, the cost of love. It was more than just pain or sacrifice. It was the weight of a system that had never cared for them, never seen them for who they were, for the truth of what they shared. And now, as he knelt in the dirt, with Margaret's body lying cold beside him, he realized that love, as powerful as it had been, was never enough. It wasn't enough to overcome the hate that had been written into the very fabric of their world, and it wasn't enough to change the course of history. The truth of their love would remain, buried deep in his heart, and the memory of her, the echo of her name, would haunt him for the rest of his days, a ghost in the shadows, a reminder of everything that had been lost. And as the cold wind swept through the land, carrying with it the bitter scent of regret and loss, Elias knew that he would never forget her. That the world, no matter how much it tried to erase them, could never take away the truth of what they had shared. Margaret had been his, and he would carry her with him always, even if it was in the silence of his heart, even if it was only a memory that would never fade. And in the end, that was all they would have left. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.